Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Edmund Mackey. Edmund is the Senior Director of Marketing at DirecTV in Los Angeles, California. Before DirecTV, he was the Director of Digital Strategy and Marketing for Terminix in Memphis, Tennessee. He made a number of impressive career transitions over the years that I am excited to share with you today. Edmund, thanks for joining me.
And thank you for having me, Angela.
Well, it's been a long time since I've seen you. I didn't mention it in the introduction, but the way that we originally met was that Terminix is owned by a company here in Memphis called ServiceMaster that I also worked for, and we actually used to sit next to each other at work.
Yes, we were colleagues, peers, and neighbors.
Right. For a very long time. So I mentioned to you before we got started that your really unique career path is what I want to focus on today, because a lot of our listeners are people who are trying to make a big career transition, and you've done that really successfully. And so I really want to kind of dig into how you started and sort of the changes that you were able to make over the years. So speaking of when you started out your career, I mean, what did you think you were going to be? What was your plan?
I really didn't have a plan at all. I mean, you know me well, and it almost seems unlikely that, I didn't have a plan, considering I planned everything else, other aspects of my life out pretty thoroughly. But I really didn't have a plan. I knew that I wanted to be, at the end of my career, I wanted to be a business owner. Mm-hmm. And so for me, when I started, like in college, I didn't really know what I wanted to be. I knew that I did get some pretty good advice early on from some professors and some mentors that, if you don't know what you want to be, try to get the best, background education that you can. And so for me, that was, majoring in economics, which is kind of a quant. It's also a lot of background at solving problems. It had a lot of things in it. I could go a lot of places with it. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't really locked into one particular thing. And so for me early on, it was just more about getting a solid sort of footing up in the education part. And then when I started my career, I actually started my career in sales. And so, that was also pretty good background from a business standpoint. Mm-hmm. Of just being able to meet people, being comfortable providing solutions to people, being comfortable, talking with people, solving problems, creating, solutions for people, and then sort of doing that commerce, that business talk, that early on really helped me in my career.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you started out in sales, what were you selling?
Actually started out selling gym memberships and personal training.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in college, I played football, I played collegiate football. Mm-hmm. I sustained an injury that sort of ended my career playing collegiately.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And then I fell into doing the rehab process, I kind of really fell into fitness. Mm-hmm. And really loved it. And from my love of fitness, and once I finished college, going into a gym was kind of like my first job, I guess you could say. And it was selling memberships, and I got certified as a personal trainer and things like that. And then that's how I kind of started my career, was as a personal trainer. Mm-hmm. I did that for a few years.
Mm-hmm. And from, understanding the business perspective, I totally agree with you. I think working in sales can be a great foundation. But from your perspective, what about working in sales really gave you an understanding of the business?
It's really how business begins and ends, mm-hmm. right? So, I didn't know this then, as a 21-year-old kid, but at the end of the day, every business only survives because of customers. Mm-hmm. And you only get a customer if you're able to convince someone that your service or your product is good enough for them to spend their money on. Mm-hmm. And so it's really, at the end of the day, gaining customers is the language of business. No business could exist without customers, and no business could exist without the revenue generated from those customers. So that's kind of really what business is at the end of the day.
I agree with that completely. And I think sometimes when we work in different parts of the business, we kind of miss that point. And I don't know, I think there's really value in being close to the revenue and understanding what keeps us in business.
Yeah, I agree. I think, a lot of people, especially, when you think about your career, taking it back to career pathing, the closer you are to customers, the more you learn from customers, the more really you can really excel in any part of the business, because at the end of the day, good businesses are always going to be customer focused. So even if you work in accounting or finance or marketing, if you're customer focused, and the more you know about your customers or the business's customers, the better off you're going to be able to, be in tune with the business and articulate how your ideas translate into either new customers or more revenue from those existing customers, which really gets you into kind of promotion mode, if you will.
Right. And so you mentioned your undergraduate degree. Did you also go to graduate school as well?
I did. I went to grad school. I actually majored in finance and accounting. I didn't do the MBA thing, so I didn't take the sort of traditional path. And the reason I didn't do a MBA, the reason I did a finance and accounting over an MBA is, at the time, I was wanting to get a CPA, and I ended up doing that as well. But it was just more, for me, it was more, I'm comfortable with the quantitative side of things, and I'm comfortable with finance and accounting. And also, I think in business, unless you go to one of these kind of top-tier business schools, people don't give you the full credit for being an MBA. But if you're finance and accounting, or if you're some, specialty that allows you to be certified, it lends more credibility, in my opinion, than having an MBA from just anywhere university. I believe these are my thoughts.
Yeah.
But that's why I chose that path.
No, that's great information, and I totally agree with you. I actually have a lot of clients that come in and they have gotten an MBA from like an online school or from a really small university, and when they apply for jobs, their potential employers don't recognize their MBA, and they're not willing to let them interview for jobs that require an MBA, and they also don't give them raises when they get the MBA. And those folks are usually pretty shocked. Some of them have gone to some of the universities that have recently been in the news for some questions about the kind of value that they're providing to students. And I do think it's really important when you choose a degree in higher ed, you get like a master's degree, that you think about it really carefully, like, why am I doing this?
Yeah, I would doubly agree with those sentiments that, when you further your education, I think it's a lot of people look at it as, hey, if I do this, then I'll get the outcome, which is, more money in their career or a higher position in their career. And that doesn't always happen, especially if you're not getting it from, let's call it an accredited university. And then I would even go higher and say a university that is sort of universally respected, unless it's in something where you can gain, some sort of certification from, like a CPA, if that's your path, or a CFA if that's your path, or some kind of internal auditing certification, and you're fulfilling qualifications through the university to maybe get those certifications professionally, then that's one thing. But just to go and say, I'm going to do an MBA, and it's not from an accredited university, doesn't always yield that outcome of more money or more prestige at work, or even, promotability at work. Because like you said, not a lot of employers give you credit for taking online classes unless they're from an accredited university, It's one thing taking online classes from, say, Vanderbilt University, and it's another thing taking online classes from, some of these other universities that, like you said, are in the news of late.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the other point, too, to what you said that was well taken is that you studied something that was quantitative. And often, if you can get that kind of foundation, you really stand out from the crowd because other people don't have that kind of, depth of knowledge into numbers. As you know, my undergraduate degree is engineering. And although most of my career has been in marketing, having that engineering background has been a real selling point when I've interviewed for jobs because it was a differentiator.
Yes. I think more and more employers are looking for, even in marketing, I think whatever part of the business you come up in, I think having a knowledge of the numbers and how business works when it comes to a profit and loss statement is very important, especially if you're trying to get to the top rungs of an organization or of a company. I mean, the one thing that all senior managers will have in common is that they all know how their organization either contributes to the P&L or affects the P&L.
Yes.
Because they can't get to that top rung of management without being in meetings where they're budgeting and they're planning for the future and they're thinking about how much cost and how much benefit and how much profit or how much revenue the company is going to generate and how my, organization aligns to that. So across the board, no matter what division, whether it's, even if you're in HR or something like that, the more you know about, profit and loss statements and, basic finance and accounting, the sort of brighter your career path can be. It gives you more options. It gives you sort of that promotability that people want. And
yes.
you don't necessarily have to go back to school to get a 2-year degree in finance to understand those things.
Right, absolutely. So when I met you at ServiceMaster, you were already working there, and I came and sat next to you. I think we were sitting in cubicles at that point. What was your position back then when you first started at ServiceMaster? What were you hired in for?
I was actually a financial analyst.
Okay.
So I think at ServiceMaster, what they had was these analyst positions within our marketing department.
Mm-hmm.
And the analyst positions were more about planning the marketing spend as opposed to general accounting that, someone might do in a typical financial analyst role. So my role was really about taking our dollars that we were spending in the marketplace and, telling the business what we were generating from those dollars that we were spending. So it was heavily, numbers driven, but it was also a little bit of business sort of acumen around being able to tell a story about how our investment dollars in marketing were contributing to customers and revenue for the business. And that's kind of where I started. So it was actually a manager role, but it was a role that I got to see a lot of the business because it was dealing with every business within ServiceMaster and then all of the marketing channels. So it was digital, it was direct mail, it was yellow pages. So I got a chance to see a lot of the business in that position, in that role.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't think I realized that it also was offline marketing.
Yes, actually, I was hired into the Yellow Pages group, if you can believe that.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
So what compelled you to take the role? Because I think before ServiceMaster, you'd held some really impressive positions. I remember talking about this with you, and I was really impressed with kind of your strategy for why you decided to take this analyst position and come to ServiceMaster. Do you remember kind of what your decision process was like?
Yeah, it really was about, for me, because before ServiceMaster, I had transitioned over into finance and strategy after business school, and I was working as an analyst, strategy analyst with a smaller company. And the reason I went into ServiceMaster was because ServiceMaster was transitioning their headquarters. So, as you know, they were moving from Chicago, which is where they were headquartered. They were moving their headquarters down to Memphis, Tennessee. And in that transition, there was a big leadership vacuum, a big leadership gap, because a lot of the people that they had in Chicago did not want to come to Memphis. And so really in Memphis, they were starting this new group. And this new group was a part of something that I thought was going to be a big thing. And even if it wasn't going to be a big thing, at least I figured I could learn a ton by starting at the ground of something that potentially could be a very big thing. And when you do that, it's a risk, but it's also a big reward at the end, too, if the risk works out.
So speaking of a big reward, when you left ServiceMaster, you were the director of digital marketing and strategy, which was a huge change from what you started, well, at least on paper. So tell me, how are you able to make that transition? How are you able to sell that? Because I don't think that you had really worked as a digital marketer before.
No, I actually hadn't worked as a marketer before ServiceMaster. And the good thing for me was that we had leadership at ServiceMaster that, one, recognized some talent within me, and two, they were sort of bold enough and brave enough to be, champions for my career. So I would say the first thing was that I had some, champions that were at a higher positions, at executive positions within ServiceMaster that sort of paved the way for me to be able to be promoted and be sort of go up the career ladder, if you will. And without those relationships, I think even with all of the talent and all of the background and all of the expertise, I still wouldn't have been able to do it. So I think that's important to point that out. And I think the second thing around that is that we were building it. And so when you're building something, you start off as the low man on the totem pole, but as that thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and as long as you're showing the capability of running it, I grew as the position grew and as the budget grew and as the sort of revenue grew. And so, that was part of the reason I came to it, was that we were building it from ground up. I think by the time you came, we were probably a year or so into it. So we were still at kind of the infancy stage at that point. But by the time I left, we had grown it into a full-fledged channel. It was digital is the largest channel at ServiceMaster, marketing channel at ServiceMaster today. When I started there, it was zero. And so, part of it was being able to sort of grow with the business, and the other part was forming those relationships with executives to sort of pave the way, if you will, to let me continue to grow it at the pace that it was growing.
Absolutely. It's funny, you talk about timing, and when I talk to clients, and sometimes on my podcast, I mention ServiceMaster from time to time, because I don't know if you know, but I bugged our vice president for 1.5 to 2 years before he brought me in.
Yeah.
I was living in Los Angeles when I first came to Memphis on vacation and had lunch with him. And maybe like once a month, I would send him just a little note to say like, hey, just want to check in with you, see how you are. I just did a website redesign or whatever I was working on. And even if he didn't respond, the next month would come and I would send him another note. Hey, just want to see how you are. And one day he asked me if I would go have a coffee with him at Starbucks. And of course, I'm very serious, so I showed up in a suit. And
and Chris is not very serious.
Right. He had jeans on and some loafers or some tennis shoes or something. And we sat down for a coffee and he just looked at me and said hey, do you want to come work for me? And I didn't even know there was a job available, but I had been bugging him for so long. I think he finally said, okay, come work here. But I mention that to a lot of people because sometimes you feel discouraged when you don't get something the first time around. But if you keep pushing, eventually, you get what you ask for.
I agree. I think forming, relationships and staying in touch with people in positions, if it's not at the current position they're in, their career migrates as well. So, sometimes, it might be, like you said, a year later or 2 years later where the opening is there for you to sort of to come in and I hate to say take advantage of it, but to sort of get the opportunity that you may have been looking for before. I think that when you're into networking, if you want to call it that, it's not always the timing of things is not always the way you want it to be, but sometimes it always ends up working out, whether it's at that company or a different company in the future.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I just want to mention, and then I have another question for you, but I think another reason that things really worked out well for you at ServiceMaster was that the person who previously represented Terminex from the digital marketing perspective, he left and he went on to another opportunity. And there was really a void for some time in that position, and you were, because you had all this knowledge of like the interworkings of the business and what we were spending and how everything fit together, you were able to jump in and kind of fill this need and really prove yourself, even though you didn't have the title in the beginning. And I think that is part of what made things work out so well.
Yeah, that's great you mentioned that. I often a lot of times forget that there was a leadership gap. That yes, we did have someone who left, and I was doing the job for about a year before I was actually promoted into it. Mm-hmm. And I was doing the job for about a year with, I hate to say, really no qualifications, but really I wasn't a digital marketer before that. I knew from planning it. And I knew from budgeting for it, I knew the channels, the sub-channels within it. I knew kind of how they worked. And digital marketing also kind of intrigued me because it was taking advantage of my strengths. Mm-hmm. That sort of quantitative with pay-per-click and SEO, things sort of were measurable. Mm-hmm. And you really didn't have to have this marketing acumen, if you will, mm-hmm. to be able to do it because everything was so measurable and quantifiable. And that was kind of right up my alley. And so, like you mentioned, when that position left, I was able to kind of step in without the pay, if you will, and without the title, and just kind of like prove myself that, I can do this. And this is something that I'm interested in. This is something that I can learn, and this is something that I may not have the right background on paper for it, but once I get in here, I can show you that I can be really good at this. And they gave me the opportunity to do that.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, too, to note is I don't remember ever one time you saying it's not cool that I don't have the right title or that they haven't given me the raise or whatever. And, a lot of people I work with, when I suggest, hey, go volunteer your time somewhere to learn a new skill, it's like, I don't work for free. They need to pay me. It's like, well, but you haven't learned how to do it yet. And kind of in the same way we go to college and we actually not only don't make money, but we pay money to go to college. You oftentimes have to, take the initiative and learn how to do things sometimes without being compensated extra. And then once you do learn, then you can be compensated for it.
I mean, that's funny you mentioned that. I was actually having a conversation with someone about a month ago along these same lines around, they were fairly young in their career and they were wondering and just talking about kind of how to get promoted and how to sort of make yourself seen to upper management so that you can get in the line to be promoted and get sort of good projects and things like that. And my advice to him was similar to what you just said, that you don't get promoted by being good at your job. And I think that's a very false thing that perception that people have. Mm-hmm. That, hey, if I'm really good at my job, then I'll get promoted into another job, mm-hmm. and then I'll get really good at that. And you don't get promoted for being good at your job. You get promoted for being good at the new job. And that new job you're moving into is going to have new skills and new qualifications, maybe. So you have to show that you have acquired those new skills to be promotable. And I don't think people get that. I don't think that's something that's intuitive in the sort of, if you want to call it, the corporate world. That people think, oh, if I just do a good job at my job, then they'll promote me to the next job. But in whatever that next job is, you may be managing people. And so if you're not managing people in your current job, then you need to build skills that show that you have matured enough to be able to manage a team. And how do you do that if you're not managing a team day to day? Well, then maybe you volunteer for a project that requires teamwork or requires people to do things in a team, but they don't report to you. You know what I mean? But you're showing your manager and executives that you're able to lead a team even though they don't report to you, because you've led this project to completion. And these people, you were able to sort of rally them, build a vision, rally a team around a goal and objective, and then go out and complete that goal and objective. And then that kind of shows that maybe you're ready for the next level of managing a team. And like you said, no one's going to promote you into that new job to see if it works out.
Right.
People want to know that you've built these skills and that it's going to be a seamless transition for you, because that's how the corporate world works. Someone is going to give you an opportunity not being really sure whether or not it's going to work out.
So over the years, in terms of sort of learning, over the years when I was sitting next to you at ServiceMaster, I kind of observed a little bit about this. But did you, once you got into digital marketing, did you go back to school and get another degree, or how did you continue to beef up on your digital marketing, knowledge?
No, I didn't go back to school after the master's to get a degree. I didn't even really do certifications, in digital marketing. What I did was I used my strength, which was the quantitative, to build acumen in the space. Some of the more technical details of digital marketing, I used our resources. So a lot of it, I just asked questions to our vendors who were doing it for us. I read books. I went out and read books of authors who were prominent in the digital marketing space. I read their blogs. I just kind of self-read on the technical aspects of it to build an understanding. And then because we were doing it every day, I was able to apply it. So it wasn't like I was just reading about something that was this esoteric thing. I was able actually to read something and say, oh, well, let me go try it at work. Let me go try it now and see how it works. I think at least me, I build a lot of learning just hands-on, just doing it. And like I said, I was doing it before I actually, was in the position. I was doing it for a year without the title or the pay. But I learned a lot during that year because I was motivated to learn how, not only how we were spending money and how it all worked, but what were some of the sort of more cutting edge things that we weren't doing that we maybe should have been doing or could have been doing to further our presence online.
I agree. And, the one thing, you mentioned this, but I noticed it a lot. You have a real strength for networking, and you're very much a people person. And so I always noticed a lot that you would talk to the vendors a lot more, like on the phone. And I noticed that you took sales calls a lot more than I did. So
I did. I took a lot of sales calls. One reason I took a lot of sales calls is because I did it for a little while, so I know how hard it is.
Yeah.
And two is I'd always learn something.
That's what I got
learn something from them, because if they were doing a new company, maybe it was a vendor, maybe it was something we were already doing, but maybe they had a different way of doing it. And so I was just able to just kind of learn how people were thinking about digital marketing and what the different aspects and nuances were from it. And so just because we had a vendor that was let's say, doing paid search marketing, I talked to other vendors just to hear what they did that was different. And then maybe I can take some of that and apply it to what we were already doing, or maybe they were doing it a way that wasn't the right way for us to be doing it. But then I was able to learn, either way I was able to learn something from those calls.
Absolutely. I mean, I would think the real takeaway is that you learned a tremendous amount, and none of it involved writing a check to a new university.
No, it did. A lot of it was just talking to people and asking them,
right?
Hey, how does it work? Why is this important? Why is that important? And then actually trying it out myself. And some of it I tried out. I started my own paid search account, and it wasn't, spending $10, $15 a day just to kind of learn and see just how to apply it to everyday work.
Absolutely. I find that digital marketing is a very entrepreneurial kind of a job. And occasionally I'll get a client who comes in and says, I want to be a digital marketer. Where can I sign up to take a class on how to do it? And I'll say, you've really got to go and teach yourself. And if you're not the kind of person that really likes to kind of roll up your sleeves and just figure stuff out, it's probably not the field for you, because it's a constantly changing and evolving field. So if you can't be kind of learning on your own, you're going to be left in the dust like immediately. So I just have a couple of other really quick questions. I know we've got a limited amount of time today, but one is, you mentioned something earlier about kind of the value that you bring to the business. You were talking about it in terms of financial information. When you prove your value to the business, how do you kind of put that out there? Like, how do you demonstrate your value?
I think, for me, it was easy. Our culture at ServiceMaster was you just mentioned it, we were in digital marketing, it was very fast-paced. We had a lot of access to executives. But I think being able to articulate what you're doing in financial terms and how it hits the profit and loss statement, how it affects revenue, how it affects customer count, how you're able to keep costs down, that's the kind of language that all executives speak. And so you have to be able to turn your daily activities, your daily contributions into those terms. Because if you don't, then there's a communication gap between an executive or your manager and you, because that's the way they're forced to think, to be in the positions that they are in a company, because everyone thinks in terms of customer count, revenues, keeping costs down, operational leverage. They think of those terms. And so whether you are, if you're in marketing, you need to be thinking about return on investment. You need to be thinking about lowering your cost per acquisition. You need to be thinking about how to gain more customers with less dollars. And that's how you're able to sort of break through that communication gap and articulate in very, very business-like terms why what you're doing is so important, or why what you're doing is so much more efficient than it was the previous year or the previous 2 or 3 years.
Yes. And I want to highlight a couple things from what you said. One is, when you do articulate it, you need to articulate it in places like your resume, your cover letter, and when you speak to people about what you do. I agree. And your LinkedIn profile. You need to put it out there, this impact that you have on the business. It needs to be quantifiable. Also, just as a side note, I recently interviewed a woman who is the CEO of an organization called Leading Women, and she actually studies mentoring. And what she found was that men are often mentored to speak with this kind of language. And I didn't know this, but she also found women are taught to sort of like be a better person and like do yoga or something, like to like meditate on how to be the best you can be.
Yeah.
And when she and I spoke, I said, when I was at ServiceMaster, I was generating, X% of the U.S. sales for Mary Maids. And she said, wait a minute, how did you learn to express things in that language? And I said, well, the group that I worked in, that was what we were measured on. And she said, it's really rare that I talk to a woman that articulates it in that way. So I think there's just a really important point for both men and women that this is an important way to talk about your value and the impact that you have on the business.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with those sentiments. And only additional point I would say is that every executive speaks that language. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not speaking that language, then there's a communication gap of really articulating your value, because value to them is revenue, customer count, lower cost. And so if you're not talking in those terms, you're really not talking about value at all.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So the very last thing I want to kind of just get your feedback on, you recently moved over to DirecTV, where you're the Senior Director of Marketing. I mentioned that in the beginning. You're in a new city and a new industry, I think probably a slightly different role. How were you able to make such a big jump?
Some of it was networking, what you've talked about. Some of it is, you've mentioned, me being a people person and knowing a lot of people in the industry. And so actually this job at DirecTV, they came to me at ServiceMaster looking for someone with my skill set, that they had heard my name from an actual mutual vendor. And so that's how it actually worked out. We were using a mutual vendor. DirecTV was using the same vendor that we were using at ServiceMaster. And when they mentioned that, hey, do you guys know anyone with this kind of skill set? They said, hey, you should call Edmund. And so once they called and I listened, I just, it seemed like a great fit from not only my skill set, but also what they were doing and the way they approached marketing, the way they approached, like we've talked about, what the important metrics are, customer count, sort of increasing revenue from existing customers. And so everything that, I hold as core values when it comes to marketing, it was also organizationally in their core values. And so it was a great fit. The people that I work with are great, just like they were at ServiceMaster. And, Los Angeles is a great city. So it worked out across the board.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, congratulations again. And thank you for joining me today. The discussion's been incredibly helpful.
Thanks, Angela. And anytime, anything.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher to ensure you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.